The night that was supposed to launch Shedeur Sanders instead turned into a spectacle no rookie ever asks for. Cameras stayed on him a little too long, analysts filled the silence a little too eagerly, and as name after name came off the board, the message became impossible to ignore. This wasn't celebration, it was judgment unfolding in real time. A draft day slide doesn't just cost position, it brands you. And for Sanders, that brand formed instantly. Overhyped, protected by his name, not built for Sundays. The clip looped everywhere. Social feeds, debate shows, timelines flooded with the same question disguised as a verdict. If teams really believed, wouldn't he already be gone? That moment followed him straight into the league. Before a single snap, before a single rep against NFL speed, the narrative locked in. Every throw became evidence, every mistake confirmation. Early rookie performances didn't help quiet the noise either. Missed reads, pressured pockets, timing issues that looked louder because people were already waiting for them. In a city that has zero tolerance for uncertainty at quarterback, patience evaporated almost instantly. Cleveland isn't a place where young passers get to figure it out quietly. If you hesitate, the conversation starts planning your replacement before you hit the tunnel. What made it worse was how public it all felt. This wasn't a slow burn of doubt, it was a pile-on. Talk shows framed him as entitled before he'd said a word. Online clips froze single plays and turned them into character assessments. The league moves fast, but narratives move faster, especially when humiliation makes good content. Sanders didn't just slide on draft night, he slid into a spotlight that magnifies everything and forgives nothing. And for a while, it looked like that moment was going to define his entire rookie year. But here's the part that rarely gets replayed. That draft night embarrassment didn't break him. It didn't harden him into defiance or push him into excuses. It sat there, quietly, in the background, while something else started to take shape. Not right away, not in highlights, and definitely not in stat lines. The story didn't flip with a big win or a viral throw. It shifted in smaller, harder-to-notice ways. In how he carried himself when the criticism peaked, in how he responded when early doubts felt justified, and in how people inside the building, not on screens, started paying closer attention. Because what happens after public embarrassment is the real test. Some players rush, some panic, some try to outplay the moment and end up letting it control them. Sanders didn't do that. He absorbed it, took the reps, took the criticism, and instead of fighting the narrative head-on, he started quietly undermining it with composure. Not perfection, composure. That distinction matters more than most people realize. And while the outside world was still laughing, questioning, dismissing, something else was brewing beneath the surface. A slow recalibration. A rookie learning how thin the margin really is in this league. A quarterback discovering that survival can matter just as much as spectacle. And the people who see everything, the veterans, the captains, the ones who don't talk unless it matters, they noticed. Because the public embarrassment made headlines, but it wasn't the ending, it was the pressure point where everything else began. The draft slide didn't just change where Shedeur Sanders landed, it rewired how people talked about him before he ever put on a jersey. In the NFL, draft position becomes shorthand for worth. Fall too far, and the conversation flips from upside to suspicion. Teams didn't just pass on Sanders in the public eye, they rejected him. Every skipped pick felt like another layer of doubt stacking up, and by the time his name was finally called, the storyline was already cemented. He wasn't walking into the league as a developing quarterback, he was walking in as a question mark that everyone thought they already had the answer to. That slide carried an assumption with it, one that followed him into every breakdown and every debate. If front offices hesitated, there must be something wrong. Maybe the tools weren't real. Maybe the confidence was arrogance. Maybe the resume was inflated by circumstances people didn't want to credit. None of it needed proof anymore. The fall itself became the proof. Draft night turned into a referendum on his legitimacy, and Sanders became the face of a warning label instead of a future project. What made it harsher was how neatly it fit into a familiar media pattern. A young quarterback with a famous background is easy to reduce. The narrative writes itself if you let it. Questions about whether he'd ever been pushed, whether he'd crumble without protection, whether the league had just exposed what college football conveniently hid. Those talking points didn't come from film alone. They came from optics, from a green room camera angle lingering a beat too long, from silence between picks. And once that perception settles in, it's incredibly hard to shake. By the time Sanders arrived in Cleveland, the expectations had already flipped. The burden wasn't development, it was disproving the slide. Every early rep was treated like a test, not a step. A safe throw wasn't progress, it was low ceiling. A mistake wasn't learning, it was validation. That's the trap draft slides create. They turn normal rookie struggles into character evaluations. The grace most young quarterbacks get was already spent before his first huddle. And Cleveland magnified that weight. This isn't a city that has time for hypotheticals. Quarterbacks here carry the ghosts of past failures, whether they deserve them or not. A rookie arriving with a draft night scar doesn't get eased in. He gets measured against impatience. Sanders didn't inherit a blank slate. He inherited skepticism, frustration, and a franchise exhausted by waiting for eventually. Every stalled drive fed the narrative the team saw something everyone else missed. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Draft slides lie all the time. Not about readiness, but about timing, about fit, about fear. History is littered with players who fell for reasons that had nothing to do with their ability to handle the league. And yet, once the slide happens, it shapes how every action is interpreted. Sanders wasn't just playing defenses, he was playing perception, and perception is ruthless. The real damage of that night wasn't the pick number, it was the label. A label that said he'd have to be more than good to change minds. He'd have to be composed when mistakes mounted, quiet when criticism got loud, and steady when pressure told him to rush. Most rookies fail that test early. Sanders didn't pass it immediately either, but he didn't let it define him, and that's where the story started to bend. Because the slide may have branded him, but it also cornered him, and what he did once there was the part nobody expected. By the time the season settled into a rhythm, the weight on Shedeur Sanders' shoulders should have been crushing. The circumstances were lining up the way they usually do when a young quarterback unravels. Early mistakes lingered longer than they should have. Protection wasn't always clean. Drives stalled in moments where confidence is supposed to grow. And hovering over every rep was the same unspoken question: how long before the team starts looking elsewhere? For most rookies, that kind of pressure doesn't inspire growth, it accelerates collapse. Each incomplete pass drew louder reactions because it wasn't just a miss, it was treated like confirmation. A rushed throw became proof of panic, a late read became evidence of overthinking. Sanders wasn't afforded the benefit of context. Most young quarterbacks are allowed to fail quietly while they adjust to speed, disguise, and complexity. Sanders adjusted under a microscope. Every flaw was magnified by the idea that he fell for a reason. That mental load is exhausting even for veterans. For a rookie, it's usually fatal. And yet, something unusual happened. When the pressure tightened, Sanders didn't start forcing the game to bend to him. He didn't chase redemption throws or try to erase mistakes with heroics. He absorbed the hits, literally and figuratively, and kept his posture the same. That sounds small, but it's the first thing to crack when confidence erodes. Quarterbacks lose their base, their feet rush, their eyes cheat. Sanders' mechanics weren't perfect, but they didn't spiral. He stayed within the structure, even when the structure wasn't holding up around him. Off the field, the noise was just as relentless. Questions circled back to draft night, to readiness, to whether the organization was already hedging its bets. Those are questions designed to provoke defensiveness, to bait frustration. Sanders didn't take it. His answers stayed measured. He didn't overcorrect or oversell belief. He didn't blame protection, receivers, or play calls. He owned the mistakes without dramatizing them. That restraint mattered more than people realized at the time. Cleveland has swallowed quarterbacks who were far more physically gifted. The problem is rarely arm talent, it's emotional volatility. When you combine a demanding fan base, constant speculation, and an offense still finding its footing, the position becomes less about throwing and more about surviving. Sanders approached it like survival was the first job. Short memory, tight focus, next snap. That mindset kept him operational while chaos tried to pull him into reaction mode. There were moments where the unraveling seemed inevitable, stretches of low completion, drives cut short by pressure that arrived faster than reads could develop. Those are the moments where young quarterbacks start seeing ghosts, where confidence erodes and habits break down. Sanders bent, but he didn't fracture. He simplified when needed, protected the football more deliberately, took what the defense allowed instead of what the moment demanded. Those decisions don't go viral, they don't silence critics overnight, but they keep you alive long enough to learn. What separated him wasn't resilience as a talking point, it was resilience as behavior. No visible frustration, no theatrics, no attempts to control the narrative. He understood, whether consciously or instinctively, that fighting the pressure only feeds it, so he did the opposite. He stayed boring when the situation called for boredom, stayed steady when chaos begged
for urgency. That approach doesn't scream star potential to outsiders, but inside locker rooms it reads differently. Because pressure doesn't break quarterbacks all at once, it breaks them in layers. First mentally, then mechanically, then emotionally. Sanders held the line on all three longer than expected, and by the time people realized he wasn't collapsing, the conversation had already shifted slightly, quietly, uncomfortably, from when will he fail to why hasn't he yet? And that question set the stage for what came next. Divisional games don't care about reputations, they don't wait for development timelines, and they don't protect young quarterbacks from themselves. In the AFC North, pretenders get exposed fast. Defenses know your tendencies, crowd noise tightens windows, mistakes don't just cost yards, they flip games. This is where hype fades and substance gets tested. And for Shedeur Sanders, these matchups became the real measuring stick, not box scores, not talk shows, not draft night clips. The first thing that stood out wasn't dominance, it was survival. Against divisional rivals who specialize in pressure and confusion, Sanders stopped looking rushed. His internal clock improved, he felt edge pressure sooner. He took sacks when necessary, instead of forcing throws that turned games sideways. That might sound conservative, but in this division, restraint is strength. AFC North defenses feast on impatience. Sanders didn't give them that luxury as often as expected. The environment made it harder. Road divisional games are engineered to overwhelm quarterbacks, especially rookies. Communication breaks down, adjustments have to happen on the fly. Sanders didn't panic when plays broke. When reads weren't clean, he recalibrated instead of unraveling. The ball came out on time more consistently. He started trusting checkdowns, started winning small decisions, and small decisions are what separate quarterbacks who can endure from ones who get rotated out by November. The matchup that shifted internal perception most came against the Pittsburgh Steelers, a defense built on disguises, physicality, and punishing quarterbacks who hesitate. The margin for error was thin, and the atmosphere was unforgiving. Sanders didn't light it up, he didn't silence critics in one afternoon, but he did something arguably more important. He stayed in control of the game. He limited self-inflicted damage. He kept the Browns competitive deep into hostile territory, and that matters in rooms where expectations are grounded in reality, not highlights. Veterans notice those games. They don't need perfection, they need predictability under stress. They need to know the quarterback won't combust when things stop going according to script. Sanders showed that. He made the right read more often than the flashy one. He protected field position. He didn't let momentum spiral after negative plays. Those are trust-building traits, even when the scoreboard doesn't glow. These games also revealed something else. Sanders didn't shrink when rival defenses tested him physically. Hits didn't speed him up. Pressure didn't force desperation. He kept operating inside the offense, even when the offense wasn't perfect. In a division where quarterbacks are hunted, that composure doesn't go unnoticed. Defensive captains,
Coordinators, teammates on the sideline, they all remember who holds steady when the chaos peaks. Divisional matchups are film that lasts. Coaches replay them differently. Players talk about them longer. They're not just performances, they're auditions for belief. Sanders may not have dominated these games, but he passed an understated test. He didn't look overwhelmed, and once that happens, the label starts to crack. Because pretenders don't survive these moments quietly. They get louder, more erratic, more desperate. Sanders did the opposite. He simplified, he stabilized, and in doing so, he forced people inside the building to reconsider something they weren't ready to admit yet. Maybe this wasn't just about surviving a rookie year. Maybe this was about earning the right to be evaluated differently. When Myles Garrett spoke up, the conversation stopped being theoretical. This wasn't a former player guessing from afar or a panelist chasing debate. This was the face of the franchise, the locker room's gravitational center, publicly saying the Browns should be planning for Shedeur Sanders as the starting quarterback in 2026. No hedging, no conditional phrasing, no "we'll see how it plays out." He said it plainly at a moment when silence would have been easier and safer. That's why it landed the way it did. Garrett isn't a hot take guy. He doesn't throw teammates a lifeline for optics or soothe fan bases with vague optimism. When he talks, it's measured, intentional, and usually late in the process, not early. For him to stake a position on quarterback direction, the most volatile subject in Cleveland, signaled something real. Not promise, belief, the kind formed through repetition, not reputation. The timing mattered just as much as the words. Sanders was still polarizing. The rookie season hadn't been rewritten by a miracle run. The questions were still loud, the margins still thin. That's exactly why Garrett's statement carried weight. It didn't come after a coronation, it came during uncertainty. It said, "We see something you're not seeing yet." That kind of endorsement doesn't come from box scores. It comes from daily exposure, practice habits, responses to failure, leadership when momentum turns. Inside a locker room, credibility doesn't attach itself to talent alone. It attaches to consistency under stress. Garrett has played with enough quarterbacks to know the difference between surface confidence and real steadiness. He's seen players collapse when expectations spike and others fade when adversity stretches. When someone like that puts his name behind a young quarterback, it's because the behaviors line up with the responsibility. Sanders had been building that case quietly long before the quote hit the timeline. What Garrett really did was shift the axis of the debate. Up to that point, the discussion lived almost entirely outside the building. Analysts weighing upside, fans debating patience, executives protecting flexibility. Garrett pulled it inward. He made it about what's happening between the walls, about a player earning trust from veterans who've bled through losing seasons and aren't interested in empty optimism. That changes how front offices have to listen. It also forced an uncomfortable pause. The Browns are used to reacting, cycling, resetting. Garrett's words challenged that reflex. If your most valuable defensive leader believes the quarterback is worth building around, walking away becomes louder, harder to justify. Suddenly, the question wasn't just, is Sanders good enough? It became, are we willing to ignore what our leaders are telling us? There's a reason endorsements like this are rare. They bind futures together. If Sanders falters, Garrett's name is attached to that belief. He knows that, which makes the statement even more telling. This wasn't a gamble for attention, it was alignment, a signal that something is forming, slowly, imperfectly, but intentionally. And once that kind of alignment shows up publicly, the franchise can't pretend the decision is neutral anymore. The conversation had changed, not because of hype, because of trust. For the Cleveland Browns, the question surrounding Shedeur Sanders isn't just about performance, it's about who they are and who they've been trying to become for nearly 3 decades. This franchise knows the quarterback carousel too well. Names blur together, draft picks come and go. Short-term fixes promise stability and deliver turbulence. Every reset feels justified in the moment and regrettable in hindsight. Sanders didn't create that history, but he's standing right in the middle of it. That's what makes this moment uncomfortable, because for once, the Browns aren't being forced into a decision by total failure. They're being forced to choose between patience and instinct. One path is familiar: move on quickly, chase a new name, sell hope through potential again. The other path is quieter and riskier in a different way. It requires admitting that growth doesn't arrive fully formed, that progress can look messy before it looks convincing. And for a franchise conditioned to panic, that's a hard pivot. Committing to Sanders means committing to discomfort. It means trusting incremental improvement instead of flashy resets. It means shaping the offense around his strengths rather than constantly hedging for the next option. That approach asks the organization to do something it rarely has: let a quarterback live through mistakes without treating them as expiration dates. The Browns haven't just lacked quarterback talent over the years, they've lacked quarterback continuity. And Sanders represents an opportunity to test whether continuity itself can be an advantage. Walking away would be easier to explain. There's always another draft, always another trade rumor, always another arm that promises instant relief. But Cleveland has chased that relief repeatedly, and the cycle keeps resetting. Each restart costs time, cohesion, and credibility. The idea of developing Sanders challenges the entire operating philosophy. It suggests the problem isn't always the player, sometimes it's the impatience wrapped around him. This is where the identity crisis sharpens. Are the Browns builders or evaluators? Do they believe in internal development or perpetual scouting? Drafting and discarding quarterbacks creates the illusion of action without the reality of progress. Sanders has forced the organization to confront whether it's willing to endure short-term friction for long-term clarity. That friction doesn't just live on Sundays, it lives in meeting rooms, roster planning, and public messaging. The locker room feels this tension too. Veterans want direction more than promises. They want to know whether they're building towards something or auditioning for the next version of the team. That's why internal endorsements matter. They expose a gap between what's happening on the field and how the franchise has historically responded to it. Sanders has become the inflection point where those philosophies collide. What makes this decision harder is that neither option guarantees success. Building around a young quarterback always involves risk, so does starting over. The Browns aren't choosing between safe and dangerous, they're choosing between familiar chaos and unfamiliar patience, and that choice will say more about the franchise than any press release ever could. Because quarterbacks don't just define offenses, they define eras. And right now, Cleveland has to decide whether this era is another short chapter or the start of something that actually lasts. This situation doesn't exist in a vacuum, and everyone inside the building knows it. A quarterback's growth is inseparable from the environment around him, and for Shedeur Sanders, that environment starts with Kevin Stefanski. Coaching stability has quietly become the hinge point in this entire conversation. You can't ask a young quarterback to develop while constantly shifting philosophy, language, and expectations around him. Cleveland knows this better than most, even if its history suggests otherwise. What stands out isn't what Stefanski has said, but what he hasn't. There's been no distancing language, no careful hedging that signals an exit plan, no subtle framing that suggests Sanders is simply holding the seat warm. When mistakes happen, Stefanski talks about process. When progress appears, he acknowledges it without inflating it. That balance matters. Coaches who are already preparing to move on usually sound different. They speak in vague evaluations. They emphasize optionality. That hasn't been the case here. Instead, the tone has been steady, focused on growth rather than outcomes. That doesn't mean blind faith, but it does indicate investment. Sanders hasn't been shielded from criticism, nor has he been tossed under the bus to satisfy narratives. He's been coached, corrected, reevaluated, and then trusted again. That cycle is what allows confidence to form without arrogance. It's also what allows coaches to see whether improvement is real or performative. Behind the scenes, the work has been slower and less visible. Practice reps, film corrections, footwork adjustments, timing tweaks that don't show up in one Sunday snapshot.
These are the details that determine whether a quarterback is learning or just surviving. Sanders has been absorbing them. Teammates have noticed the consistency, not the volume of words, but the repeatability of habits. That's usually the first marker coaches trust. The complication is that Stefanski's own future isn't untouchable. Coaching stability only works if it actually exists. The Browns face a rare crossroads where quarterback and coach development may rise or fall together. Moving on from one likely means moving on from both. That's why the decision around Sanders carries broader implications. It's not just about who takes snaps, it's about whether the organization believes in the infrastructure it's built or whether it's preparing to tear it down again. Quiet endorsements often matter more than loud declarations. A coach continuing to put a young quarterback in teachable situations, designing game plans that assume learning instead of fear, allowing mistakes without pulling the emergency lever at the first sign of trouble. Those are signals. Sanders has received them. And in a league where trust is fragile, that kind of consistency speaks volumes. If Cleveland believes in continuity, this is the moment to prove it. Quarterbacks don't become leaders in chaotic systems. They become stabilizers when systems stabilize around them. Stefanski's approach, measured and deliberate, suggests he understands that. Whether the organization aligns with that understanding will define more than just the next season. It will define whether the Browns are finally willing to let growth breathe. By the time a season reaches its final stretch, the numbers stop telling the full story. Stats can be debated away, context can be added or ignored, but late-season film doesn't lie. For Shedeur Sanders, these final games carry weight that goes far beyond completion percentage or touchdowns. They're about response, about whether improvement is surfacing when the pressure is highest and patience is lowest. Front offices don't evaluate these moments like fans do. They aren't hunting for breakout performances that erase everything else. They're watching for patterns. Is the quarterback correcting mistakes faster than defenses are exposing them? Is he processing information quicker than earlier in the year? Is his body language steady when the stakes climb? These answers matter more in December and January than any early season flash. Last impressions linger longer than first ones. A strong finish doesn't rewrite a rookie year, but it reframes it. Sanders doesn't need to dominate these games, he needs to manage them. Controlled decisions, fewer self-inflicted errors, timely responses after adversity. Those are the details that stick in meetings when executives start drawing off-season roadmaps, especially for a team debating whether to reset or refine. Consistency late in the year becomes powerful evidence. What's quietly encouraging is where Sanders' growth is showing up. Mechanics tightening, footwork staying composed under edge pressure, routes anticipated rather than reacted to. When plays break down, he resets with intention instead of improvising out of panic. These are traits that develop over time, and seeing them surface late suggests the learning curve is bending the right way. The final games also test leadership. Teammates know when the season's goals are slipping. Effort either dips or sharpens. Quarterbacks reveal who they are in those moments. Sanders has continued to prepare like the evaluation is still ongoing, because it is. Every rep, even in games that won't make headlines, becomes part of his case. Coaches notice when a rookie stays dialed in after disappointing results. Veterans notice it too. This stretch forces clarity. If Sanders finishes the season playing efficient, composed football, the Browns can't treat development as hypothetical anymore. It becomes visible, tangible, and that shifts the off-season conversation. Instead of debating replacements, the focus turns toward refinement, supporting pieces, system tweaks, stability. The difference between those two paths is enormous. The league is full of quarterbacks who flashed early and faded late. Fewer finished strong while carrying uncertainty. Sanders has the chance to separate himself, not through spectacle, through reliability. In a franchise starved for direction, that might matter more than any single stat ever could. This is where everything narrows. Not to a stat line, not to a headline, but to a choice. The Cleveland Browns are standing in a moment that feels familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Familiar because it involves uncertainty at quarterback. Unfamiliar because, for once, the uncertainty isn't rooted in collapse, it's rooted in growth that hasn't finished yet. Shedeur Sanders didn't demand belief through dominance. He earned consideration through resilience. He didn't silence critics with spectacle. He made them hesitate through steadiness. That's a harder case to dismiss and a harder one to fully commit to. Growth asks for patience. Chaos asks for action. Cleveland has always been quicker to choose the latter. Chasing another quarterback would be easy to explain. New draft class, new trade rumors, new hope packaged as urgency. The league encourages movement, activity, resets that look bold in press conferences. But history has shown what that path usually brings here. Short memories, short leashes, and long seasons spent wondering why nothing ever sticks. Sanders represents something different. Not certainty, direction. What makes this decision heavier is that belief inside the building has already started forming. When leaders align around a young quarterback, ignoring that alignment becomes its own risk. Development can be fragile. It can be undone by indecision as quickly as by failure. The Browns now have to decide whether they trust what they're seeing or whether they default to what they've always done. There's no perfect ending to this story. No guarantee that patience pays off, but there is a reality that can't be avoided anymore. Sanders has made himself more than an afterthought. He's forced an honest conversation about identity, about belief, about whether this franchise is ready to grow with a quarterback instead of cycling through them. Growth is uncomfortable. Chaos is familiar. The Browns don't need another experiment. They need a foundation. Whether they choose to build it or break it will define more than one season. It will define who they are willing to be next.